Hey everybody, Marshall here to share some really cool news with you. I trust at this point you've all heard about Kvik yeast. This is that Norwegian ale strain that can ferment cleanly at temperatures as high as, no joke, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. Absolutely crazy stuff. Well, last year, Imperial Yeast dropped A43 Loki, their Kvik strain, as a seasonal release, which meant we all had a pretty small window to get our hands on some. Not anymore. Imperial Yeast recently announced they're making A43 Loki a year-round strain due to popular demand. They're excited about it. I'm super excited about it. I've had some amazing beers fermented with Loki at terrifyingly warm temperatures. It is amazing stuff. Go grab some A43 Loki and see what all the fuss is about for yourself. The most identifiable characteristic of IPA, whether of the West Coast New England or Midwest substyles, is hop character, the majority of which comes from adding hops to the beer either during or toward the end of fermentation in what we call dry hopping. Now, from a purely common sense perspective, it would seem that larger dry hop additions would lead to a greater hop aroma, a concept that's influenced the approach of many brewers of hoppy beers. It wasn't until fairly recently that this quote, more is better maxim was called into question, not just by skeptical homebrewers, but legit real scientists. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and I'm joined by contributor Cade Job to discuss what I think is a really fascinating idea when it comes to dry hopping rates.
Yeah, we're going to talk about whether or not there's a dry hop saturation point today. And I don't know about you, Marshall, but I can't tell you how many times I've been at a homebrew meeting or seen a comment or something on an IPA or something that needs more hops, quote unquote. More, the American way, right?
Absolutely. And the American way. The other, to me, what's interesting or what's kind of funny, I guess, is that in the years that I've been brewing and drinking craft beer, it's been quite a few years now, it seems to be this competition almost, like who can pack in the most dry hops into their beer, and it's just like this measuring contest, if you will, about I put in how many pounds per barrel, how many ounces or grams per 5-gallon batch, and I guess I've brewed a lot of IPA over the years, and my interests have shifted towards more lager styles, but back when I started brewing them, I remember thinking, God, I put 4 ounces in the dry hop for a 5-gallon batch. That's so much. People laugh at that nowadays.
Oh, absolutely. I rember when I first was doing an IPA, I think it was 1 or 2 ounces, and it was an IPA.
Yeah.
If you look back at those 1990s recipes from IPAs, there's almost nothing in the dry hop. As compared to now, certainly nobody's putting 12 ounces or something, or 20 ounces or whatever people are doing these days, a pound of hops in a batch. In a
5-gallon batch, right? But back then also, I recall a good majority of the hops went in at the 60-minute mark because it was all about bitterness back then.
Oh, yeah. You got to have that bitterness.
That's right, yeah. We've shifted toward more hop character, hop aroma, and flavor, which, again, is a dry hop thing. Now, one thing in this episode, we're going to be mixing up measuring stuff. We're going to be saying ounces, grams, pounds per barrel, stuff like that. So if we forget to lay them all out, please forgive us. We are going to try to be as clear as possible when we're talking about this stuff. So, well, speaking of the dry hop saturation point, the researcher behind this concept, Dr. Tom Shellhammer from Oregon State University, will be taking questions from Brewlosophy patrons later this month. If you're unaware, Dr. Shellhammer is one of the foremost hop researchers on Earth and is credited as introducing not only the idea of there being a point of diminishing returns when it comes to dry hopping, but the concept of hop creep, which has been getting a lot of attention lately. To get in on this live Q&A session, all you have to do is become a patron of Brewlosophy by visiting patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where a small monthly pledge gets you all sorts of cool rewards. Access to a private Q&A session, for example, is a mere $3 a month. We've had a ton of great guests in the past, and all new patrons get access to those videos to watch whenever they want to. Other rewards include access to unpublished recipes, inclusion in a private Brew Crew online group, and unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com. We continue to hear from our patrons that the rewards are more than worth the pledge, so that's good to hear. And all of that goes towards helping us to continue bringing you this show. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your online shopping, we would really appreciate that as well. Your shopping experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback that helps us out a little bit. So feedback this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear from fittings, kettles, and fermenters to brew stands and incredibly well-built well-built turnkey systems. If you haven't given them a look yet, go do yourself a favor and head over to brewershardware.com the next time you're in the market for brewing equipment. They're sure to have whatever it is that you need. And be sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Dominic Duffner from St. Louis, Missouri, after listening to episode 93, which was focused on reducing cold side oxidation, said that he stopped cold crashing altogether because of suckback issues, but proposed what seems to be a very interesting solution. He says, once fermentation is slowing, the blow-off tube can be replaced with a much longer, maybe 10 to 20 foot coil of plastic tubing or vinyl tubing. The remaining fermentation would drive out any CO2 in the tube without having to worry about getting any krausen in it. Then when you cold crash, any suckback would be the CO2 that's in the tubing, and there would be enough length to prevent water from getting sucked back in. The water, if your end of that tube is in a bucket of water, it seems like it would work well, though you would need to make sure you'd need to make sure you time the hose switch right. Also, I'm not sure how much suckback there would be, and if it would be enough to pull water back in. This is actually an idea that I've heard before. I think someone on some homebrewing forum somewhere had mentioned it in the past. That's nothing I've tried, but it seems like it'd probably work pretty well. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would. It seems like it's kind of the same concept as your balloon lock, right? I mean, you're talking about a volume of space that the gas can occupy, that you can push out from the fermentation while it's still actively fermenting. And then whenever you cold crash and that pressure creates suckback, you're not sucking the balloon into the keg, because you've got a sufficient volume. So, I mean, it seems to me like, I don't know the physics of it in detail, but it seems to me like if you had a long enough hose and enough space that the gas could contain in there, that, yeah, you'd keep the suckback in the tube and it wouldn't go into the fermenter. That's interesting. I might have to try that.
I'm sure there's people out there who have tried this, and if they're listening to this episode, please let us know. It almost seems like a better idea than the whole balloon lock thing, because for me, I never have blow off, but I use my fermenters I do 5 1/4 gallon or 5 1/2 gallon batches in 7 gallon fermenters, and I control my fermentation temperature. So I don't get huge kroisens, and I haven't had a blow off in years. So I could start with that tubing connected. And one of the thoughts that I had was maybe, fill it about 90% of the way with water, and then connect it to the fermenter. That way you have kind of a visible sign, a visible way of knowing that CO2 is pushing the water out. And then you're totally 100% certain that that tubing is just full of gas, so that when you do your cold crashing, then you can kind of watch the water go back up in the tubing. It'd be interesting. Definitely be interesting to try out. Again, if you're doing that already, please let us know. My guess is about 20 foot of tubing would be more than enough. I don't know if 10 foot would be enough, but I'm not sure how much. One of the other questions Dominic asked was like, did you know how much air is getting sucked back into the fermenter during the cold crash process? I really don't. All I know is that when I've done it with an airlock, all of that water ends up back in the fermenter. So.
Yeah, I think you could devise a little experiment. I'm not sure that this would actually work, but if you had the ability to put water and measure the amount of water that was actually sucked back from the container where you're sticking it into, if you had the ability to manage how much reduced and just totally did a fermentation without any extra hosing or anything like that, and measured the amount of water that got sucked back in there, maybe that would give you an equivalent volume, and then just figure out what the inner diameter of the hose is and multiply that out. I mean, that's probably more complicated math than I can do, but I think you might be able to. You might be able to figure that out if you can figure out. It seems like a volume issue to me.
Yeah, me too. And the thing is, I think it's going to be different based on I would think now, this is stuff doesn't really interest me that much, so I'm not going to think too hard about it. But all I'm referring to is the amount of stuff that gets sucked back during the cold crash. I would imagine that fermenter volume matters, that the amount of beer that's in that fermenter would make a difference, that the level with which that your blow off bucket, with the water sanitizer is at, would make a difference. You still run the risk of starting a siphon if it's higher. There's all these things that you have to kind of take into account. But still, I think it's a great idea, Dominique. If you end up trying it out, let us know how it works. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com. homebrew.com or drop us a note on social media. So I think it was about 7 years ago now that I took my family, which at the time was just 4 of us, little Olive wasn't born yet, out to Binghamton, New York to visit my brother and his family, who a couple years prior had moved out to New York from Fresno. While he was here, he caught the craft beer bug and even ended up getting into homebrewing. We brewed his first batch, in fact, on this trip. Anyway, while we were sampling the different beers of New York one evening, or of that region really, Marco, my brother, said he splurged on something special and pulled out a bottle of Sam Adams Utopias, which is described as a, quote, extreme barrel-aged beer. The price tag on this beer is commensurate with its high ABV. Well, listener Carl Helmstetter reached out to me a couple months ago saying he too had some Utopias on hand that he thought my friends would really enjoy.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
It looks disgusting. It looks like poo water.
Yeah, it doesn't look good.
He called the shit poop. Old man Clemens
Can't
hates
wait
the
to drink
shit.
some of this. I could actually,
Dude,
you could smell it from
is this?
here.
Could this be that Pruno stuff that Marshall always talks about that they make in the toilets in prison?
It might be.
That's what I'm calling it. Oh,
Holy smokes.
gotta be a barley wine.
Yeah, with some turpentine in it.
Oh my God. Oh mein Gott in Himmel. Dude.
I haven't tasted it yet.
Oh man, I want to watch.
Oh my, what in Sam Hill is this?
Your beard fell off. It's a little strong.
God.
It's a little strong. Woo. I don't even know. This is a beer review, right? We didn't change it to like gasoline review.
Wow.
I mean, you can just tell by looking at it. It's
Got some caramel going on.
caramel and some other stuff.
And-
caramel and kerosene.
Jeez.
It's strong.
It's very strong, but I do get some caramel out of it. Yeah.
Oh God. I can't drink anymore.
I'm going to drink one more.
Oh God. Oh.
That's definitely Grandpa's cough syrup.
I have
right
no
there.
idea what I got. Maybe a barley wine. I don't know.
I believe it is.
Okay.
But
I have no review.
it's no good for me.
I need to cleanse my palate, but I don't have a palate. It's burnt
I
off.
just smoked it.
Oh, I've never almost hurled before in a review, so I give it negative 700 jerseys. It's not for me, that's for sure.
It's not for myself either. Ugh.
Kill it with fire.
First off, I have to say, Carl, thank you so much for sacrificing the last few ounces of Utopias on Jersey and Tim. I hope it was worth it for you, though I'm based on the fact that they weren't huge fans of it, I'm not sure it was. I gotta be honest, they didn't really like it. This beer, I don't know if you've ever had it, Cade. This beer is bahoozy. I mean, it does not taste like beer. It tastes like a barley, caramely barley whiskey. I had the same experience with this one that I did when I was sampling it with my brother 7 years ago. Holy cow. It's a complex beer, to say the least.
I didn't know that this beer existed before listening to this beer review, and I can say I don't think I'm very likely to go try this beer based on Jersey and Tim's review. Saying a beer tastes like gasoline, kerosene, and turpentine, those are generally things I like to avoid drinking.
Well, I mean, it
but-
is Jersey and Tim, Cade.
Yeah, fair enough. And so I looked this up whenever you sent me the beer review, and the description of this thing, it says some of these beers have been aged in barrels for 24 years.
Ay, ay, ay.
Like, and I was going, holy moly,
Yeah.
that seems like a long time. But I mean, who knows? I've had some really good old ales that I like.
Yeah.
Some of that barrel age and that alcohol boozy character is really nice as it ages, it mellows out. Thinking about some like old cognacs or something that
Yeah.
you've got.
I will say, they commented on the way it looked. It did not look pretty, and I have to wonder if that was because it was literally the last probably 4 or 5 ounces of beer in that, and Carl, I'm going to send you back your bottle. He asked me to send it back to him, and I just got to find some time, but it's stowed away, so I'm not going to throw it away, but it was the very bottom of this really neat looking bottle. And, perhaps there were some dregs down there or something like that, and that's why it looked so bad. I don't remember what it looked like when I had it basically off the top of the bottle with my brother, but it did, it it tasted the same as I remember it tasting. And I'm telling you, I mean, you had a lot of like that dark fruit character, really barley wine-esque, but just so much alcohol. I mean, 28% for a beer. If I had shifted my kind of expectation to be more Scotch-like, or kind of have more like a spirit or something, maybe I wouldn't have experienced it the way that I did. Did it taste good? I mean, it was all right. Was it something that I'm going to go out and buy myself? Not a chance in hell. No.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. 28%. I mean, that's huge. That's
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, who knows? I'll give anything a try once. If I'm ever up there and can try it, I'll give it a try. But
Yeah.
I'm not
Well-
going to be rushing down to the local beer or wine store to pick up a bottle today.
I'm not even sure you can. I think you have to like special order it from
really?
Sam, and they don't. And there's like 6 or 7 states, maybe even more, where they just don't even sell it. They won't.
Is it that exclusive?
Yeah. It's an
Okay.
inter-
All right. Well, good on y'all for taking that off out of the shelves then for me, it sounds like.
Well, Carl, again, I think that was very cool of you to send that out to us. I know that it's a special beer that you shared with your father, and we always appreciate the kind of sentimental side of beer. So.
Yeah, very cool. I like that you sent this out to us, Carl. That's a cool one, a fun one to taste with a lot of story to it.
Absolutely. Well, if you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be back right after this short break. So I've been hanging out with brewers and craft beer nerds for a long time now, and while we do occasionally have our differences, one thing it seems we all share is a love of learning and trying new things, as well as saving a couple of bucks. Well, right now, Craft Beer and Brewing is helping fans of Brewlosophy learn more while saving some coin by offering 20% off the price of a subscription to their awesome magazine. Chock full of brewing insights, tips, and recipes from industry experts, Craft Beer and Brewing is seriously great. I read every issue page to page myself. To get 20% off your subscription, all you have to do is sign up at beerandbrewing.com/brewlosophy. Want to brew quality craft beer at home? The Grainfather provides a brewing system with superior design, innovative features, and the latest technology, allowing you to brew professional quality craft beer at home. Mash, sparge, boil, and cool all in one unit, meaning there's less equipment to use, clean, and store. No need for burners or hot plates. Just plug it in and brew great beer. Then get the best out of your fermentation with the Grainfather conical fermenters and glycol chiller. Plus, enhance your brewing experience with the brand new free-to-use Grainfather community app. You can take your brewing tools and your recipes with you everywhere, use brewing calculators on the fly, manage your recipes, and monitor your brew session from anywhere. Use your mobile device to manage your Grainfather brew wirelessly, automate mash schedules, and multitask without removing any of the brewing hands-on fun. Grainfather products can all be found at www.grainfather.com. Plus, as a Brewlosophy podcast listener, get 10% off your order. Just use discount code Brewlosophy19 at checkout. That's BRULosophy19 to receive 10% off your order. So head to shop.grainfather.com now to get this great deal. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Exchillerator.com today. If a moderate dry hop charge produces a pleasant character, then an extreme dose will lead to extreme hoppiness. It's an idea that on the surface seems to make sense, and based on the reports of some homebrewers, larger dry hop additions do lead to more hop character. But is there a point where it stops making a difference?
We did an experiment on it, but before we get to the experiment results, let's talk about it. Let's explore this idea of dry hop, what it is, what it does, and is there a point where you get too much?
Yeah, that's one of those things that in homebrewing circles, I think does kind of get. Lately it's been talked about a little bit more, but I mean, I can't tell you how many times in, when I'm at a club meeting or hanging out with a bunch of homebrewers, the talk is about, I put 6 ounces in this one. Next time I'm going to do 8 ounces because I really want to up that dry hop character. And it's a very general conversation. I just want to up the dry hop character.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about it earlier. It's kind of like a measuring contest, right? Like, oh, well, you only put 6 ounces. Well, I put 8 ounces. Well, I put 10 ounces. Well, I put 15 ounces. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it reminds me of that Monty Python sketch, the 4 Yorkshiremen. If you haven't Googled this, you should go look. But it's basically 4 guys sitting on a round table trying to one up each other. And it's really, really good classic Monty Python.
Oh, God. The things dudes will do to try to look better than their friends. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a good one.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about dry hopping in general. This is I'm sure everybody listening knows what it is, but in essence, it is the addition of hops to fermented or fermenting beer. I think lately a lot of people have been adding the dry hop charges during kind of midway through fermentation, or even at the kind of like one day into fermentation, high Kreuzen. A lot of New England IPAs, people are adding their dry hop charges then. But I think traditionally, the dry hop charges were added towards the end of fermentation, or even once the beer was finished fermenting. And if my understanding is correct, the idea sort of stemmed from the preservative aspects of hops, that they would shove a whole bunch of hops into the fermented beer before throwing the barrels on a ship to ship across the ocean, because of the preservative effect of hops.
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding as well too, that this is how this whole started. I mean, I know that there's a dispute right now about what IPA, India Pale Ale, means and how it was started and who claimed it and why it has so much hops in it and all that stuff. And I don't want to get into that, not the subject of this podcast. Right. But we do know that brewers were packing a bunch of hops into barrels because it did have a preservative effect. And, arguably, it makes sense that whenever these things got to their destination, they tasted different than the beers that didn't have these hop preservatives in there. So adding hops to the beer after the boil, one of the things that you prevent is you're not adding additional bitterness, but maybe adding hop aroma, flavor characteristics that you wouldn't otherwise have in the beer.
Yeah.
Now, there is some bitterness component. I think we're finding out, especially some new research and even the research that we'll get into today that Dr. Schellhammer did, that there is some increase in bitterness from dry hopping, but nowhere near as much as if you're adding it in the boil, isomerizing alpha acids and creating a really strong bitterness profile.
Right. And I like the word bitterness profile, that term, because if you've ever, all you have to do to prove to yourself that dry hopping imparts at least some element of bitterness, take a couple pellets of hops, take some cones or whatever, soak it in some, 150 degree water, or you could even soak it in just tap water, 68 degree water for about 20 minutes, let it steep for about 20 minutes and then drink that water. It is bitter as hell. I've done this multiple times just for fun. I don't know why I do things like that sometimes. But
the hop tea. That's the classic hop tea.
It's a classic hop tea.
Yeah, that's a great way. Also, if you're trying to experiment and figure out what a hop is going to add to the beer, soak it in some water and see what it tastes like. And that'll show you what the hop, taste the tea. I don't recommend putting the hop pellet or the cone directly in your mouth. That's pretty.
You want to hear how big of a jerk I am? My youngest daughter, Olive, she's 6 now, but about 3-4 years ago, when I'm brewing, they come out in the garage and hang out and do this. Well, I dropped a couple of hot pellets on the ground as I'm wont to do on a brew day, and I turn around and she's got it in her fingers.
Oh no!
And she's giving me that look like, Daddy, should I? And I was like, I looked at her. I said, Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Your turn.
The look on her face.
Dad of the year, Marshall.
Oh, God. I'm such a jerk. I know. Don't call CPS. I give my kids beer and let them eat hot pellets.
I bet she won't do it again, though.
Oh, there's definitely not a chance of her doing that. But hey, maybe that's why she's the only one. I was talking in our Brews Views episode who still enjoys the flavor of beer. She asks me for it every day. So
maybe so.
Yeah,
maybe so.
Maybe that's what it was.
I mean, so dry hop, the whole point of doing a dry hop is this idea that you're going to get hop aroma and flavor components that are going to come out and be expressed more highly when you're not boiling them or adding them at a hot temperature.
Yeah.
There were, like we talked about, there were some antimicrobial stuff in the past, but now that we've sort of, we're fermenting in, stainless steel tanks, we're putting in kegs or bottles, we're not dealing with wood that's got a huge amount of oxygen ingress, and we're trying to eliminate oxygen ingress. We don't, and other bugs being in the fermenter or in the packaging.
Yeah.
We have a lot more control over that these days. So the antimicrobial aspects of hops aren't necessarily as important to us today as they might have been.
Exactly. I don't think about when I'm thinking about brewing beer, the whole like preservative or antimicrobial aspects of hops doesn't even come to my mind. I mean, that is not something I'm thinking about at all. I'm thinking about how do I get this delectable hop character to stay in my beer? What's the best way to add the hops? What's the best rates at which I should be adding hops? I'm not thinking about it with, is this going to keep bugs from growing in the beer?
Yeah, exactly. And, I mean, adding hops, there's a lot to add, right? I mean, there's citrus character, there's herbal tea character, there's piney character, some fruity character, pineapple character, some of these things that we really like to have in beer that taste really good.
Yeah.
And that add a lot of flavor, a lot of complexity to beer. I can't remember exactly how many, but I know there's huge numbers thrown around. There's hundreds of compounds that add that could be added,
right?
Through hops that change the flavor,
right,
of the beer.
And that really is the point. I mean, I remember when I first started kind of dabbling in the method of dry hopping, which wasn't that long ago, maybe 2008 or 9 is kind of when it came to mind. And the first IPA I ever made, way back in 2003, it didn't even get a dry hop. I mean, I didn't know what it was back then. What it got was like 2 ounces at 60 minutes. It was bitter as shit. But
that's exactly right.
Yeah. But we've learned over the years, and we've seen with the whole like West Coast IPA, and then that if you can actually watch. I mean, if there was like some way to visualize this, you would see hop additions moving further and further and further and further along down the line. And now, honestly, the good chunk of hops in a well-made IPA or even a pale ale nowadays usually comes in the dry hop, and you see a lot of people with these hazy IPAs not even making early additions. They're throwing all of their hops in either in the whirlpool or maybe within the last 20 minutes of the boil. And then it's all in the dry hop, right? Because they want to extract those terpenes and those hop oils that are known for imparting all of those wonderful hop characters, myrcene and linalool, and all the other terpenes that are in these popular hops these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we look at the increase in New England IPA. That's a huge hop charge in the whirlpool, and then a dry hop charge. You're adding a lot of hop material after the boil's over. There's obviously a trend, it seems, to adding more and more and more and
right.
more and more hops. But before we get into whether there's a saturation point, I did want to ask a question, Marshall. What's your typical dry hopping schedule? How do you typically dry hop?
That's a good question, and I had to actually pull up some old recipes because I honestly just don't dry hop I don't make beers that require a dry hop very often. I'm brewing really simple, some might call them boring lagers most of the time. But I went back and I looked, and I would say that the average dry hop rate for beers that I made in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, for IPA that I made in the last 4 or 5 years, was about 120 grams. That's, divide that by 28.6 and you've got ounces. So I think you're looking right around 4 ounces or so. Mm-hmm. And that, those are like modern. That's me knowing about this whole dry hop rate race basically. And I'm still sticking around, and I've won awards with IPA dry hop, 5-gallon batches, of course. Dry hopped at about 4 ounces per 5-gallon batch. I made one beer at one point where I put in, I think I did 12 ounces, and
wow.
I don't know if I did it right. I lost about a gallon of the beer to hop absorption, and the beer did not turn out good. I didn't like it. I don't know if that was because of some other factor or if it was because of the crazy dry hop. But typically for me, I'd say about 120 grams, in the dry hop. And I do a single one. I mean, when it comes to dry hopping, this as well as I do. There are so many different things people are doing nowadays. From the point at which you dry hop, are you doing it at high krausen or after fermentation? Are you going to double dry hop? Are you going to split that dry hop into 2 different additions? For some reason, some people think there's something magical that happens when you do that. And then I think, of course, like we're talking about in this show, the amount with which you dry hop.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, and I'm right around there too, around 4 ounces. Maybe up to as much as 5 ounces for a dry hop edition. Especially once we get to the experiment results, I'll talk about why I still do that. But I mean, that to me gets me the profile that I want. I'm usually adding my dry hops during fermentation while fermentation's actively going. Usually 3 or 4 days after fermentation's kicked off, that's when I'm adding my dry hops. I've occasionally done a second dry hop afterwards, at like day 5 or day 6 or something like that. But you can totally add dry hops whenever after the process,
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think I've moved towards when I'm going to dry hop a beer, I do it about 2-3 days into fermentation as well. And my whole reason for doing that is to avoid cold side oxidation. If that beer is still fermenting, presumably it's going to scrub that oxygen, any oxygen that's added when you add the hops to the beer, as opposed to that oxygen potentially having the negative impact that we all so loathe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I do it like that too. We'll talk a little bit about the experiment that Dr. Shellhammer did. Scott LaFontaine, I think, is the student that wrote it with him and then did it with in his lab. But we can talk about what they did in a little bit. But I wanted to sort of talk about that experiment and why I came up with this idea to do the experiment for this dry hop, whether or not there's a dry hop saturation rate. Because we know there's all these things that we want to put in beer. Is there a point at which the things are no longer solubly able to come out of the hops and into the beer?
Right. I mean, and it's funny because I say that it seems to make sense that, if a little bit of dry hop adds this nice character, then adding more should amplify whatever that character is. What Shellhammer and his students kind of came in and I think their hypothesis to kind of boil it down, what they're looking at is going, well, is that necessarily true? Is there a point of diminishing returns where you're actually throwing in dry hops that aren't doing anything because that beer has already, in essence, is already saturated with the terpenes and whatever other compounds from those hops that you get during the dry hop. So you're not adding anything else. You're actually losing hops / money by adding more. They're wondering if there's, if that's the case. One of the things that I thought about as well is on top of this hypothesis that they discussed and that they ended up researching, which is fascinating. By adding more hops than you might potentially need, are you contributing to some other off flavor, something that you may not want in the beer, or maybe people do enjoy it? Something like I've heard people say like grassy character. There's a lot of leaf material on hops. Obviously, they are a flower. Do you end up extracting like chlorophyll flavors? That kind of vegetal stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that they've also talked about in the experiment that they didn't get to study a whole lot, like what remains in the hop material, right? Like after everything's done, or what's actually being transferred out of the hop material into the beer, and then what stays in that hop material. They kind of left that open, which I think is another fascinating way that they can that hops can be explored and dry hops can be explored in the future.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
You're right. I mean, the point of this study was, distilling down the hypothesis is more hops better?
Yeah. Is more hops better, or or does it even make a difference? Really, is how I kind of looked at it. And so
exactly.
what they ended up doing, what Shellhammer and his team ended up doing, is looking at dry hop quantity and comparing varying rates, ranging from, correct me if I'm wrong on this, about 2 grams per liter to 16 grams per liter. They did various tests with this, which is equivalent to about 1.3 to 10.7 ounces per 5-gallon batch, or for the professionals out there, 0.5 to 4 pounds per barrel.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what they did, and they ran that. So they made they made 5 different beers of different concentrations, like you said, between 2 grams per liter to 16 grams per liter, or 200 grams per hectoliter, 1,600 grams per hectoliter.
Right.
And what they did was they did one of the things I think was fascinating is they ran this both through a sensory panel and through some analytical data, to see what they actually came out with. Maybe maybe we can see some things analytically that we don't necessarily see sensory, and vice versa, which I thought was really fascinating. So what they did in designing this study, they took what they're referring to as a, quote, unhopped beer. I put that quote unhopped I put that in air quotes, or podcast quotes, I guess, because they added some isohumulone. Essentially, I guess it's liquid extract or powder. I'm not exactly sure how that came, but that just imparted some bitterness to the flavor. But they didn't add any hops during the boil because they wanted to test what the impact of dry hopping would be. So they're calling it unhopped beer in quotes, and the grist was, I thought was kind of interesting too. So they did an 86% pale row, 13.5% caramel 10, and then another 0.5% caramel 120, and then they used a Scottish ale yeast, but that seems like a pretty standard kind of pale ale.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Recipe for me. And then they used a single bale of Cascade hops. So just testing Cascade hops on this one. I think that one's important too, especially with some of the feedback and questions that we got with the article that we'll come back to later. But they used those Cascade hops, and what they did in terms of their process to get the dry hops into the batch, which I thought this was interesting, is they transferred, I think it was 40 liters of beer into 2 individual kegs. Then they added the dry hops to those, purged the kegs, inverted them a few times to make sure it was all mixed up, and then let it sit for the amount of time that they let it sit. I don't have those notes in front of me, but if you shoot me an email and want to know what the timing was, I can send that to you. And then they blended the 2 kegs together, so that they got sort of a homogenized version of the beer whenever they ran it through testing. And so I wanted to pause right there and say, so it looks like what they did, if I read the study correctly, and if I didn't, please shoot me an email, kate@brewlosophy.com, and we'll correct it on feedback. But what they did is they had vacuum sealed hops under nitrogen, opened up the kegs, dumped it in, and purged the kegs. And this is after fermentation was completed. So they had already filtered it, they'd removed yeast, and after fermentation was completed, which I think is also really interesting because now you're really isolating the dry hop process.
Yeah, I do too. Well, we can talk about all of the processes and the methods, but if you go read the article, it's out there. You'll learn all of that.
Yeah, the conclusions are really where I think is where the meat of the article is, because they came up with some really interesting stuff.
Absolutely.
And they measured not only overall hop intensity, which I think is something that's important, how much hop aroma intensity. They didn't measure like bitterness or any of that. They didn't measure bitterness from a sensory perspective. There we go. Finally got it right. They measured overall hop aroma intensity, and then they focused on 2 of the hop characteristics that are pretty consistent in Cascade hops, which is that citrus, some people would refer to it as grapefruit flavor, and then an herbal or tea quality. And those were the sensory characteristics that they focused on. And what they found is that at some point for overall hop aroma intensity, you reach this diminishing point of returns. And they found that it's somewhere around 8 grams per liter, or 800 grams per hectoliter. And Marshall, I don't have the
I got you covered, Cade. That's 1.1 ounces per gallon, which would be about 5.5 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. We can round that up to 6 ounces even, or about 2 pounds per barrel, 2.1 pounds per barrel. So when you think about it, they're finding a point of diminishing returns past the point at which I've been dry hopping already. So it can be argued that I still haven't reached my my hoppy, I guess, ceiling at this point yet in my own brewing.
Yeah, exactly. And I find this fascinating, right? Because essentially what they're doing is they're saying from a tasting and sensory perspective, if you put more than 6 ounces of hops in a 5 ounce or 5 gallon a typical batch size, you're just essentially throwing hop material at it and maybe not increasing the hop aroma flavor to a point that it's useful to add additional materials.
Right.
And it's actually one of the findings that they specifically point out in the paper is, hey guys, for commercial breweries, this could be really inefficient for you.
Yeah, right. One of the quotes that I love from Shellhammer, he says, dry hopping with more than 8 grams per liter is an inefficient use of raw materials.
Yeah, right. Like totally inefficient. Like, why are you doing this almost?
One of the things I'm really excited for when he comes on the patron Q&A is to ask him about that. Well, I guess to ask him about how, because he seems to discuss this when you read papers, or we published an article written by another blogger a while back on that he went and actually saw Shellhammer give a talk somewhere, and he seems to speak of these findings with a fair degree of I don't want to say certainty or like absoluteness, but confidence almost, like that you are wasting hop material if you dry hop more than 8 grams per liter, which a lot of people are still doing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the analytical results, I mean, that's what I think this experiment was really well designed, in my opinion. I think that's why it's getting a lot of attention, because they did both a sensory and an analytical approach to this.
Exactly.
So not only were they able to say from a sensory standpoint at over this 8 grams per liter, you're not improving your overall hop aroma intensity, or you're not diminishing returns. It does consistently go up. I want to be clear about that. But diminishing returns, you're talking about going up very small incremental amounts over that.
And you're and again, inefficient use of raw materials. You're no longer getting what you're hoping to get out of these hops. That would justify using the amount that you're using in essence.
Yeah, and they ran this through some analytical tests too, which I found really fascinating. And so they did some analytical tests over bitterness and said, yeah, bitterness increases analytically. They didn't do any sensory bitterness tests, but bitterness increases as the hopping rates increases. And one of the things I think that I found really fascinating was herbal and tea quality that they were focusing on continued to increase as they increased the amount of dry hops, but citrus had a definite drop-off point. And there were other, terpenes that they were able to measure and actually analytically measure, maybe not focus on from a sensory point of view, but analytically measure and show that the same things were happening in other of these terpenes, these flavor-active compounds in hops.
Yeah, it's one of the findings that I thought, and this is a tough one for us to really measure the way that they did, as kind of garage scientists. But one of the findings that I was just absolutely floored by is that like you said, that herbal tea quality continues to go up the more hops you add, which I don't like that quality in my IPA. So
me either.
Serve me a nice, kind of. I guess like an English special bitter or something like that has that, and I'm okay with it, but not in my IPA. So the other interesting thing that they found was that the oils responsible for citrus aromas, which are commonly sought after, I mean, that is what people want in their hoppy beer, saturate closer to 4 grams per liter. So even lower than the proposed 8 gram per liter saturation point of the dry hop overall, which amounts to about 2.5 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. That's nuts to me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I find that totally nuts too. I mean, you think about people, I see them all the time doing this with Citra. Now, I know Shellhammer did Cascade, but Citra has much more of those terpenes and terpenes that produce that sort of citrusy character. So people are dry hopping with Citra in these massive amounts, and Citra's a hop that's highly sought after. It's on the expensive range of hops.
Yep.
I don't think there's any shortage issues this year, but it's one of those that's really highly sought after. It's hard to get your hands on sometimes, hard to get your hands on fresh versions of it.
Yeah.
This study seems to me to indicate, hey, maybe with that hop, you don't necessarily have to do the high levels of dry hop that we've been seeing, even commercial levels or homebrew levels or any of those things. I think that's really a fascinating way to look at this experiment.
Oh yeah, totally. There's a quote that I'm looking at right here that's in the study as well that I'd like to read because I think it's interesting. It says that adding more hops by static dry hopping does not simply lead to increased aroma intensity, but also changes aroma quality in the finished beer. Dry hopping rates greater than 8 grams per liter lead to hop aromas that were more herbal tea in quality than citrus, as you said, Cade. To maintain a more balanced hop aroma quality, this study suggests using a static dry hopping rate between 4 and 8 grams per liter, which again is approximately 2.3 to 4.5 ounces per 5-gallon batch. That is just, I mean, I'm thinking of all of the people I know who have gone to the, I think Brian's one of them, Brulosophy's Brian Hall. I think he does somewhere around 6 to 8 ounces per 5-gallon batch when he's making his New England IPA. And there's this conviction that these brewers have that it really is having a positive impact on the hop character of their beer. Now, one of the things that we were interested in, I think what inspired the experiment that you ended up doing, Cade, is if If this is the case, if the 8 grams per liter, if that ceiling is where you start to lose hop character, then we shouldn't be able to perceive a difference between a beer that's dry hopped, that 2 beers basically that are dry hopped above 8 grams per liter, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we wanted to focus on this on our little, our homebrew level, for the experiment purpose. So the idea is let's do both beers above the level of where we have these diminishing returns, and let's see from a sensory perspective if just looking at 2 beers that are above this level, if people can tell a difference.
Absolutely. I think it's just incredibly fascinating experiment. Of course, all we focus on, or the most of what we focus on, is the sensory side. So you performed this experiment. We're going to talk about those results when we return from this short break. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, did you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When I first read about Dr. Shellhammer's research, I was admittedly hesitant to accept the idea that anything more than 4.5 ounces for a 5-gallon batch, or 6 ounces for a 5.5-gallon batch, would lead to diminishing returns. I mean, pretty much everyone I know who brews IPA regularly uses quite a bit more than that. I'd be interested to get Brian's opinion on this again, especially after reading the research and the experiment that you did. But it was for this reason that I was so excited for you to test this one out, Cade. Tell us a little bit about the way that you designed this experiment to compare, the dry hop saturation rate.
Yeah, so we wanted to go with an IPA style that had a lot of dry hops on it, that had a significant amount of dry hops. So the recipe that I used was Ray Found's Mac IPA. That was the base recipe. And then the only thing I changed was I did a little bit of change on the grist, not too much. I think he had I can't remember. It was maybe 7.5% or something of the Munich malt. I just did a 90-10.
Yeah, I think that his recipe might have a little splash of honey malt, and you went with like
oh, there you go.
90% pale malt, 10% Munich light, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So just a really simple IPA grist, and then added a bittering charge of Magnum, and then some 15-minute additions of Citra, Amarillo, Mosaic, and Centennial. Get it, Mac?
Yeah, that's so clever.
Yeah, so clever. Way to go, Ray. And then what I did, and then dry hopped with various amounts. So one of the batches got a dry hop of 7.4 ounces in a 5-gallon, it's a 5-gallon batch. So that's for imperial units. That's as close as we could get to 10 grams per liter or 1.3 ounces per gallon.
Yeah, and that's so you're doing what, 5.5 gallon batches?
Exactly, 5.5 gallon batch.
Yeah, and for the people who want a little bit more detail, the beer was mashed at 154 degrees Fahrenheit, 68 C, for 60 minutes. It was boiled for 60 minutes with those hop additions, and then it was split but evenly. I mean, you did exact volumetric. They were exactly the same in identical SS brew buckets, right?
Yeah, exactly. I made sure that exactly the same amount. I didn't want anybody to say, "Oh, well, there was more wort in that one." Or
so, how much wort did you? Do you typically do like 5.5 gallons or?
Yeah, I do 5.5 gallons. I actually marked it in there in the SS brew bucket where it gets to 5.5, and that's what I do.
Okay, so now you pitched Imperial Yeast A16 Independence. That's not one you see people using often, but I found is very, very good. It's a fantastic strain.
I loved Independence in this beer, and I thought it was great. It really accentuates those fruity and those citrusy characters. I loved it. Yeah,
it's a fantastic yeast. Paul has been using it for the Hop Chronicles, or he was using it for a while, and yeah, I love it as well. Fermented it at 66F or 19C, and then it sounds like for this one you kind of waited a little bit before adding the dry hop charges. You went like 5 days into fermentation.
Yeah, exactly. I was about 5 days into fermentation because I wanted to make sure that we got. I was worried about cold side oxidation, so I didn't want to do it after like Shellhammer's experiment because I didn't have the ability to control adding those hops, and I didn't want oxidation to be the issue here.
Right.
I wanted it just to be the difference in the amount of hops. So I waited late into the fermentation, but while fermentation was still actively happening, so that I could get and hopefully drive off any oxygen-related issues.
Yeah, I know. I think that was the best approach. And just to reiterate, 7.5 ounces went into one batch. 11 ounces went into the other. That is a fairly drastic difference in hop amount. And for those who prefer grams, like I do, that's 210 grams versus 312 grams, which, given the 5.5 gallon volume, amounts to about 10 grams per liter versus 15 grams per liter. And that was what was your plan was to get as close to that 10 versus 15 grams per liter as possible, right?
Yeah. I think it was actually close to 16 grams. I have to go back and look at the math, but yeah, it was to try to get over that 8 grams per liter
for both
threshold. Yeah. And then go as high as Shellhammer did on his, which was 16.
Right. And just again, you used a varying hop varieties, but you used the same ratio for each batch. So in essence, what we were testing was similar ratios at different rates, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So same ratios of the hops. I didn't want there to be more hops or anything in there. And in this one, I wanted to use different hops than just Cascade.
Right.
Interested to see what Citra and Amarillo and Mosaic, which are very citrusy hops, interested to see if that diminishing returns that Shellhammer suggested in his research paper was consistent using a different brand of hop, a different type of hop.
Yeah, I love it. And what we're doing in essence is kind of expanding from a sensory perspective, again, kind of expanding the realm within which this saturation point idea kind of fits. You let the beers ferment out. They both finished at the same 10-11. We could talk about hop creep, but we're not going to do that here in this episode. You cold crashed and packaged the beers under pressure to reduce oxidation, which can really diminish hop character. So good call there. Then you burst carbonated, let the beers cold condition for 5 days before serving them to tasters. So first thing to note is the way that these beers ended up looking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the beers looked identical. I mean, I couldn't really tell a difference between them at all, which was great. That's kind of what I expected to see. And so, it's always just nice whenever, your process comes out.
Yeah, well, and if you look at the photo on the experiment article at brulosophy.com, to me, if you kind of get really hypercritical, the higher dry hopped one, the 15 grams per liter batch, looks maybe a little hazier, but I think that might just be condensation.
That's actually fair. I mean, there was a very, very slight haziness. I get as I think back, and I'm sorry, I know I'm backtracking from what I just said, but actually, as I think back, I remember that the dry hop one, the one that had more dry hops, was ever so slightly hazier.
Okay,
Neither of them cleared up, by the way. But the one on the right was ever so slightly hazier.
Yeah, I found that Independence yeast is slightly powdery. It does seem to kind of keep a faint haze, if you will. It's not murky mud like some of those beers you see out there today. But
yeah, both of these beers were relatively clear. But did have some haze in it.
Yeah, we call that homebrew clear in our.
Yeah, there you go.
So before we get into the blind participant results, what was your impression of these beers? How did you try? I mean, I know that you tried some triangle tests.
Yeah, I tried three semi-blind triangle tests, and I identified the odd beer out exactly 0 times.
Okay, so now I like I said in the opening of this segment, I didn't really think that this was going to be the case. I'm a research guy. I'm an empiricist to the core. I admit it. I still thought that at 15 grams per liter, you were going to get at least be able to tell it apart based on having more herbal or tea character. I was not ready for you, the brewer who knows everything about this damn experiment, to not be able to tell these beers apart. So it shocked me.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look back at the article, you can look at the picture of the two measured hop things. And if you look at that picture, there's 2 bowls. One of those bowls is about, half the size of the other bowl. You can't really tell that from the picture. It was a mound of hops in each of these beers. I mean, the 10 grams per liter was a mound, and then the 15 grams, I have big hands. I couldn't fit all of those hops in, a handful. I mean, it was massive.
The delta between the 10 grams per liter versus the 15 grams per liter at the 5.5 gallon batch. So you're 210 grams versus 312 grams. That 102 gram delta is what I usually dry hop with. When you think about it in that context, these beers, on a surface level should have tasted, in my, kind of a naive perspective, should have tasted massively different.
Yeah. And I read Dr. Shellhammer's research beforehand. So I was well aware of what his research said. Like I said, I always try to put aside my bias as much as I can, approach every beer as if I'm tasting it for the first time at a competition, run through my judging process. I really tried to figure out if I could get these beers to taste differently. I read the research and I saw it, but adding that pile of hops into each of those beers is really, really difficult to look at the amount of hop material that you added in there, that I added in there, and think that there's not going to be a difference.
Yeah, it doesn't, logically, it just doesn't feel like it makes sense, but scientifically, does it? Well, you served these beers to 28 participants. Did you collect this data can we give a shout out to your homebrew club? Where'd you do
of course. Yeah. Shout out to Austin Zealots. I mean, they're really helping out with doing these tastings. Great palates. We've got a whole mix of people out there.
Well, we'll determine whether their palates are great or shitty based on how they did on this experiment, Cade, because that's I don't know if you know, but that's how this works. Figure that one out.
Yeah, exactly. No. I mean, a bunch of good judges out there and beer drinkers. But yes, 28 people did this. We would need 15 to be significant, and we only had 13 that made the accurate selection. So, by the way, the participants were served 2 samples of the beer that was dry hopped at the lower amount, the 10 grams per liter, and 1 sample of the beer that was dry hopped at 15 grams per liter, for those of you who want to know that information, but not significant.
To nitpick, yeah. Well,
yeah. Not significant.
13 out of 28 people. That's 46%, not even half. The fact that people couldn't tell these apart, that blind tasters couldn't tell them apart, that you couldn't tell them apart, really, I mean, it does seem to support the findings of Dr. Shellhammer's much more astute research. And I find it absolutely fascinating that a beer dry hopped at 10 grams per liter doesn't seem to have any more or less hop character, good or bad, right, than the same beer hit with 15 grams per liter. Just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, this one was fun to talk with participants after.
I bet. Yeah,
telling them what the variable was at the end of the day. Everybody was, wow, you really put almost 3/4 of a pound of hops in one of those, and it didn't taste different. People expected to see. People expected to taste grassy flavors or things like that.
Right.
Hop material, vegetal character. We always hear about that. If your beer is in contact with hop material for too long, there's vegetal characters and all that. Nobody identified any off flavors. There was no vegetal character, no grassy hop, or no grassy flavors. People just weren't able really to statistically tell a difference between the two beers.
It was just another regular old crappy Cade IPA, right? That's
yeah. No, I really liked that beer. I got a gold medal on this beer. So
good job, man. That's awesome.
Yeah,
well,
so,
you can thank Ray for that
on
one.
On the lower IPA one, I didn't introduce the 16 grams per liter one because despite my best efforts to siphon off clear beer from that, there was still a massive amount of hops that got into the keg.
Yeah.
And it was a nightmare.
Well, and
that's
serve. That's another, I think, implication of these results alongside what Shellhammer is kind of saying is that you don't have to throw that amount of hops at your beer to get the character that we're all after. And which means, consequently that you are going to have a greater yield. You're not going to have as much hop absorption. You're going to be able to leave behind more of that crud, there's just not going to be as much in your fermenter. I think there's a lot of good that comes with this kind of research. And it's been a while since I've said this, but I'm kind of glad the results turned out the way they did. It feels good. Like these results just feel good to me, which I know for a quote unquote scientist to say isn't probably the best the best thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you like to see consistent results, right?
Yeah.
I mean, from just a scientific perspective, repeating experiments, we get flack all the time that we don't repeat our experiments over and over and all that. It's interesting for us to see a commercial or level experiment in a lab at Oregon State University done under really tight controls, and then a homebrew level experiment, which is still, controlled and intentionally so, that has similar same results.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's gratifying.
The only thing that I want to see now, and we've done experiments like this in the past, but it was before Shellhammer's research. And so I'd like to see something more inspired by the findings of Dr. Shellhammer and his colleagues, and do a comparison of, say, something like 5 ounces versus do something more like 4 grams per liter versus 9 grams per liter, and see if you can tell those apart. I would imagine if the point of diminishing returns, if that's what we're calling the dry hop saturation point, is right around that 8 grams per liter mark, then you would think that you would be able to consistently perceive a difference between a beer dry hopped at, say, 4 grams per liter versus 8 grams per liter.
Totally. I'd love to dial this in a little bit, if we can, dial it in and figure out, exactly maybe, what hop, a Cascade or Citra, just a single hop, not the mix that we did here, but just a single hop, and see how that one changes at 4 ounces versus 8 ounces or any of those things. I mean, a lot of opportunity for additional exploration, I think, both on our level at Brewlosophy, but also for Oregon State and other researchers.
Absolutely. Well, we got a bunch of reader comments on this one, as you might imagine. We're going to go through a few of those now. The first one comes from Laurent, who said, I read the study by Dr. Shellhammer a while back and was pretty surprised, obviously. I've kept my dry hop additions under 8 grams per liter since, and it has indeed saved me quite a bit of money for the same end result. Very nice to read that your experiment shows the same conclusion.
Yeah, so there's another data point right there from Laurent that he's having a similar experience.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with him. I included that comment because I feel the same way. I don't make many dry hopped beers, but you better believe when I do, it's going to be that dry hop addition is going to be under 8 grams per liter. I just don't like wasting raw materials, as it were.
Totally.
Yeah. Next comment comes from the Brew Club member, in fact, Matt Skillstad. He says, this matches my own experience with large single doses of hops not providing quite the impact I was looking for. Anecdotally, additional doses of dry hops added to the keg on top of a, quote, saturation level size dose in the fermenter does seem to provide an additional boost in my experience. Oh, very interesting. He says, I wonder if the large hop addition was split into 2 additions if it would have been discernible. Marshall did a single versus a double dry hop experiment a while back where he compared 5 ounces at once versus 2.5 ounces added at different points, and that one turned out to be non-significant. Now I wonder if it would be significant if the double dry hop batch received additional hops instead of the same amount split in half.
Yeah, so this one was really interesting to me. Great comment, Matt. Based on the results from this study and what Dr. Shellhammer's studies did, specifically the fact that Dr. Shellhammer did 2 different kegs and then blended them together.
Yeah.
Splitting the hop addition into 2 additions, I'm not sure necessarily would have made a meaningful difference. It's totally possible. It really seems like, to me that what we're talking about here is how much material can get into, how much flavor and aroma can we get into the final beer.
Yeah.
And the concept, I did want to mention this too. The concept of the saturation point is something that Marshall and I are using to describe this concept.
Yeah.
Dry hop saturation point is nowhere in Dr. Shellhammer's paper that was written. But I think it's useful, and I think it makes sense based on his findings.
Yeah, so do I. And I will, I've been communicating with Dr. Shellhammer. Again, he's going to be a guest this month on our Patreon live Q&A with patrons, and he was pleased with the fact that we were curious enough to test this out. He's aware of what it is we're doing, and he was I think he was kind of happy with the results as well, and didn't say anything about us inventing this idea of a, quote, dry hop saturation point.
One more thing too, Matt, about that comment. I was thinking about this comment after, and I read the study again after thinking about your comment. And one of the things that he does say is there are certain terpenes that did continue to increase, right, as we're going forward. So theoretically, if you did a certain amount of one, and then did a second batch of another that's maybe has higher terpenes that would increase, then actually, you may get some sort of hop aroma increase. I think you're still going to run into some saturation issues based on the result of the experiment, but I think even Dr. Shellhammer's research points out that there's opportunity to study this concept going forward.
Absolutely. And I mean, Matt's comment about maybe the double dry hop thing, and I don't know. The whole double dry hop idea doesn't make much sense to me. I don't know who invented this concept that if you add hops 2 days after adding a first dose that it's going to somehow be different. But that hasn't seemed to be the case in my personal experience nor my experiment that I did on it. So next comment comes from Will Allwart. He says, I'm curious if you measured the yield difference between the 2 batches.
Yes, I did measure the yield difference between 2 batches. Unfortunately and unintentionally, because of the amount of hop material that was in there. There was easily an extra half gallon of beer left in the fermenter of the one that had the 15 grams per liter hop material.
That makes sense to me.
I mean, yeah. Easily a half gallon of extra material, and not to mention probably a gallon or maybe even 2 gallons left in the keg that I ended up just throwing out because it was impossible to serve from.
Exactly.
There was just so much hop material that was in suspension. It kept clogging my dip tubes, and even whenever it got it through the dip tube, clogging the outpost or clogging the connector, the quick disconnect. It was painful.
Yeah, no thanks. God.
To transfer from that batch. Tasted fine. Like I said, I didn't have any problems from a flavor standpoint, but serving at that level of hops was very difficult for me.
Yeah. All right. Jay Breidenbach He says, is it possible that the heavier dosed beer's hop profile would hold up better? If the high dry hop beer has a higher oil load, but we cannot perceive it, maybe over time it will hold up better. Kind of a ceiling effect. That is a really interesting concept. My question about this idea is, if the beer is saturated already, are those oils actually present? Based on the analytical, the objective analysis of these beers, to what I read, it sounded like it's not that it has more oils; it's that those oils, it's saturated already. It can't hold any more of those oils; they just fall out of solution.
Yeah, I mean, that seems consistent with what I would say, Marshall. I would say that I think that, there may be, I mean, this is certainly something that you could look at in the future. I mean, there's a saturation concept, but again, we did see some terpenes that would continue to be extracted at a higher level. So I think there's some aspect of hops that may be increasing over time, despite the fact that we're getting diminished returns and that stuff. So I don't know. Certainly something that might be interesting to look at in the future.
Also, though, if you're making IPA, just drink it, man.
That's right. That's exactly right. Drink that stuff fresh. Don't let it sit.
Yeah. All right. Final comment comes from QQ. I have no idea. That's an interesting name, but it's worth noting that the Shellhammer work used Cascade. You brought this up, Cade, earlier, and I do think it's interesting. And it's possible that the threshold will be different for other varieties depending on what chemicals their flavor depends on. One can imagine that the thresholds will be higher for varieties that, for example, depend more on thiols for their flavor.
Yeah, that's exactly right, QQ. And I think this is correct, that it's possible that there may be threshold differences for other varieties. And Shellhammer did just work on Cascade, but I think one of the things that may be consistent with his findings across different hop varieties is that 8 grams per liter saturation point. Because even though some terpenes are still continuing to increase, you're getting real diminished returns on overall hop aroma impact. That's the big overall study, the big overall aroma impact that the hops are contributing, the things that we're looking for in dry hops. I think that finding, especially since we use different varieties here, again, varieties that used that similar citrus, which, Dr. Shellhammer showed actually had diminishing returns.
Yeah.
It's very possible that some varieties may have different threshold levels, but I'm guessing, again, this is a total guess. I have no empirical experience or analytical data to base this on, but that 8 grams per liter threshold might be something that's pretty consistent across hops.
Yeah, I'm not so privately, I guess, now hoping that's sort of the case, because it's nice it's nice not to have to worry about adding more, but it's kind of unique in this thing. Well, Cade, that does bring us to the end of this episode. Do you have any parting words before we skedaddle?
I'll say it again. I said it a couple of times. Serving that beer with the high levels of hops was really difficult. I don't expect to ever use even probably 7.5 ounces of hops, the lowest level that we did in this one. The beers came out. I want to medal with it. So, hey, if you're using hops and you like your experience, if you're using that level of dry hopping, then continue to go for it. I feel like a broken record. I've said this at the end of every podcast. If you're doing what you like with your beer, keep on doing it.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing to repeat over and over again. I couldn't agree with you more. I certainly don't plan on dry hopping again. And I've said this already, more than 8 grams per liter. And it's nice to have multiple research findings back that up. Listen, if you want to read more about Dr. Shellhammer's findings, you can head over to Brulosophy.com. There's a couple of you've got the experiment article that we discussed in this episode, as well as a guest article written by Patrick Woodward of Pat's Pints blog. And don't forget to check out all of the other sciencey stuff we're up to as well. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no